That right there, that was the number one song of 1973. Tony Orlando and Dawn with Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree. But history isn't determined by Billboard charts alone. Oftentimes, music that went overlooked during its own era will prove the most enduring. Or at least just as enduring as those beloved hits. Author and researcher Andrew Grant Jackson joins us once again. His new book is called 1973 Rock at the Crossroads. Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
You know, 1973 is not generally looked back upon as a pivotal year in popular music, like 1956, for example, or even 1965, which you wrote about in your last book. But as this new book of yours details, 1973 really was a year of big changes.
Yeah, you know, I like to think of it as the year that rock kind of peaked and began to die and was reborn all at the same time, because it was the last blockbuster year where all the 60s giants kind of released classics at the same time. You know, you had the former Beatles going, the Stones, Dylan, Zeppelin, Who, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, James Brown, Elvis. And then you had these veterans who had been around, but they suddenly shot to the top, you know, like Pink Floyd with Dark Side of the Moon, and Bowie and Elton John, and even Bob Marley. The Wailers made their album debuts in the States. And then you had all these new guys who released their debuts, like Springsteen and Billy Joel and Queen and Aerosmith, New York Dolls, Lynyrd Skynyrd. You know, people don't realize what a phenomenal year that was on that level. But then it was also interesting because radio programmers began to perfect the album-oriented rock format. You know, they kind of fused AM top 40 with progressive FM, which later became classic rock, which obviously has so much fantastic music, but it also kind of pushed out anything that wasn't kind of white mainstream rockers.
Right.
So things began to stagnate to the extent that by like the early 80s, you only had like 9% of the number one singles were by black artists for a while there. But at the same time, underneath, all these great new genres started to bubble up that would eventually rejuvenate music, being punk and disco and hip-hop and reggae and techno and outlaw country. You know, so just so much stuff was happening on so many levels.
So what I thought we'd do is talk about this book in a roundabout way by playing 5 songs. And actually, I wanted to begin, because you mentioned it briefly about outlaw country, I wanted to begin with Waylon Jennings and This Time.
Yeah, that year, 73, he and Willie Nelson both started releasing albums that are considered the beginnings of the outlaw country genre, where they kind of fused rock and roll and hippie aspects with, you know, the country genre, because they finally got free of Nashville, which up till then had been dictating to them. You know, they couldn't use their own bands, they couldn't record in the studios they wanted.
Right.
You know, they had to put the strings on and all that kind of thing. But Willie Nelson left for Atlantic Records, and he was given a lot more freedom. And then Nashville was scared of, RCA was scared of losing Waylon, so they gave him more freedom. And so they started releasing these albums like Shotgun Willie and Honky Tonk Heroes. And This Time was an album that, you know, it was Waylon's album, but Willie actually worked on it a lot too, and they recorded it in the autumn, and it technically came out in 74, but the title track This Time was Waylon's first number one country single, and after that, then they could totally do whatever they wanted.
We're talking with author Andrew Grant Jackson. His new book is 1973 Rock at the Crossroads. You've read his work before in Rolling Stone magazine and on Slate.com, but this new book examines a year that heretofore really hasn't been given maybe the attention it deserves. And up next, as we just cherry pick 5 songs from 1973, one of my favorites, David Bowie and the song Watch That Man, track 1 on the Aladdin Sane album. The funny thing is, when you look at David Bowie in 1973, It's almost like he's predicting what 1983 will look like. He's always ahead of the curve. What can you tell us about Watch That Man?
Yeah, that was he was in New York. He was obviously super inspired by Lou Reed and also the New York Dolls. And I think he might have written the song Watch That Man after, like in the after party of a New York Dolls show. But I personally think he was inspired a lot by Lou Reed because it's kind of even similar to his Waiting for the Man in some respects. And there's a character in the song where, Bowie's in this kind of lame party, but then he goes to the street to get the word from the street, and he finds this really mean guy, which is obviously like Lou Reed,
right,
but who gives him a new sensibility that really inspires him. And Bowie's whole album that year, Aladdin Sane, he said it was called Ziggy Goes to America, or Ziggy Under the Influence of America. And, there's songs on there inspired by Lou and then Iggy Pop and, the New York Dolls. And so I think in this one, too, Watch That Man, he tried to get the Stones sound because he was definitely trying to catch up with Mick Jagger, who was one of his big influences.
David Bowie, Watch That Man, 1973. We're joined by rock historian Andrew Grant Jackson. His new book, 1973, Rock at the Crossroads. I think by 1973, it's safe to say that glam was kind of on the way out. It would have a rebirth in the 80s, but it was more or less finished, and it wasn't too long before David Bowie turned his sights toward R&B and reinvented himself yet again.
But who was ahead of him, and that was Mark Bolan was actually getting much more R&B too, and he brought in some black female backing singers, and then Bowie did the same thing like a little bit later, But those two were both definitely big rivals,
Speaking of R&B, one of the kings of R&B and pop, Marvin Gaye, teaming up with Diana Ross on a song, My Mistake Was to Love You. What can you tell us about that one?
Actually, both Marvin and Diana had number one hits in '73, Touch Me in the Morning and Let's Get It On. But before those worked out, Berry Gordy was a little worried about Diana's career, and he actually appealed to Marvin to do a duets album with her, like Marvin had done with, so many other great Motown female artists like earlier. But at first Marvin didn't really want to do it because he knew that they were both kind of prima donnas. But they actually did it. It was recorded over kind of during the period where Motown transitioned, where they closed down shop in Detroit and came out to L.A., and it was produced by Hal David, who Berry Gordy had kind of put in charge of recreating the Motown sound in Los Angeles with the Jackson 5. And, they ended up, Marvin and Diana, recording separately because he would, like when she first came into the studio, she was pregnant, and he was in the sound booth just filling it with pot smoke. And so she, she was like, I can't expose my baby to that. And Barry tried to reason with him, but Marvin Gaye was like, I'm sorry, I got to have my smoke, And so, which was probably a passive aggressive way to avoid, I don't know, hanging out with Diana or whatever. But I guess they do that a lot now with duets albums. People aren't even there in the same room. Sure. But the song, I think, it's kind of a forgotten. It made it top 20 in both pop and R&B. But I think it's a little forgotten today, but I think it's a really great bittersweet song. Nowadays,
you don't even have to be alive to do a duet, so.
Right.
And that was the number 2 best-selling single of 1973, Jim Croce, Bad Bad, Leroy Brown. Andrew Grant Jackson is our guest this hour. And earlier I was mentioning how there were bands and songs that may not have been incredibly popular in 1973, but over time, they've grown to be appreciated and respected, and the music makers themselves have been lifted into the pantheon of the all-time greats. Big Star would be an example of that, a band that hardly anyone paid much attention to in 1973, now considered an incredibly important and influential band. The opposite is also true. Three Dog Night were enormously successful, had hit after hit after hit, but for some reason, over time, they are not held in such lofty company. They're dismissed by the rock critics and historians, but not in your book. And you point out that Shambhala, one of their big records, was an important record of 1973.
Yeah, they seem to be, they were kind of affiliated with Brian Wilson a lot, right? They were friends with him. And so it seemed like they were part of that Hollywood pop, kind of scene like Harry Nilsson and all that. So,
right.
Maybe they'll get their resurgence one day, but I guess they weren't, I'm not sure if this song they didn't write themselves, so maybe because they weren't writing their own things and playing their own instruments, people aren't as enamored with them at this period or something. But yeah, that song was really interesting because, we're kind of, we think of the 60s as the time where everybody got, into the Eastern mysticism, which was actually pretty interesting. One thing I discovered was up until 1965, immigration was very, unless it was like Northern Europe immigration, it was pretty restricted. But then in 65, they opened it up. And so all these people from the East or Asia began coming to the U.S., like a lot of yogis and people teaching, yoga and like Hare Krishna and all that. So, there's a boom in the Eastern mysticism, and it actually seemed to kind of peak to an extent in 73 because they made that movie Lost Horizon, which actually kind of bombed, I guess. But that was based on the novel where there was Shambhala was a mythical city in Eastern, like Tibetan religion, but they changed it to Shangri-La there in the movie. But even though the movie bombed, a songwriter wrote the song Shambhala about Daniel Moore, and then Three Dog Night made it a hit, and then he rewrote it again kind of as Maria, which the country singer B.W. what was his last name? B.W. B.W. Stevenson.
That's it.
So,
yep.
So that was always the song. Just it seems kind of so euphoric. So I love that one.
The last one we'll talk about today, and it's interesting to me because there was a nostalgia boom, certainly for the 50s, that sort of began in the late 60s and was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And by 1974, the following year, you had Endless Summer coming out, that Beach Boys compilation, which was a huge hit. So You wonder, what were the original rock and rollers doing in 1973? And Elvis put out a single that, to me, is so good, I'm surprised that it wasn't really a big, big hit. But what was Elvis doing, and with the song I've Got a Thing About You, Baby?
Yeah, that was it made it to number 4 country, but it didn't seem to, cross over into... it didn't become one of its big 70s ones like, Burning Love. But he was actually still going really strong in 73 because he did Aloha from Hawaii via satellite, which was a live performance. That the album was number 1, and he was NBC's biggest show that year. And, he played more shows than any other year in 73, like 167. And his movie Elvis on Tour won the Golden Globe, and his album He Touched Me won the Grammy Gospel. And so he behind the scenes he was starting to falter, through the drug use and everything. But he was he still looked good, on the surface. And he did 2 sessions at Stax Records, the R&B Records place that was in Memphis, kind of near his house. And I've Got a Thing About You, Baby was recorded in the first big session in July, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of All Shook Up in that in the sense that it doesn't have like a huge drum beat or anything. It's just kind of like a very kind of upbeat, mellow song, and really bright and kind of one of his last big happy ones before all of it became like kind of doom about his marriage falling apart.
Right. Well, this is a fascinating book, 1973, Rock at the Crossroads. If you're wondering what was going on in 1973, it's probably more than you ever really thought about, and it's all condensed here in this book. Andrew, where would someone go to get the book and catch up with what you're doing these days?
Let's see. Well, I've got a page for it on Facebook, and then if you just go to Facebook in 1973 book, it's right there, and there's links. You can buy it anywhere, from Amazon to Barnes & Noble to, there's many places people can order it. It comes out on December 3rd. So I hope everybody checks it out. And, thank you again for having me on your great show.
Thanks so much, Andrew. You have a great rest of your day.
You too.